My name is Daniel Harker. I'm 39 years old, and I live in a quiet corner of Manchester, a place where the rain never seems to stop, and people pretend not to see each other's pain. I used to think that was comforting. Now I realize it's the perfect setting for betrayal. Quiet, discreet, unspoken. I met Clara 3 years ago at a friend's engagement party. She wasn't supposed to be there. She came as someone's plus one, a replacement for a friend who got sick. I remember her standing by the window, red wine in her hand, looking like she was thinking about something far away. When she laughed, she didn't do it to be heard. She did it like she couldn't help it. And that small, effortless laugh ruined my balance completely. We started talking that night, and for the first time in years, I felt something real. I had spent most of my 30s buried in work, long hours, cold dinners, and quiet weekends. She changed that. She reminded me what warmth felt like. She made me believe I wasn't just existing. We moved in together after a year. Everything about her seemed perfect, not flawless, but real. Her quirks, her sudden silences, her obsession with late-night reading, it all made sense to me. I thought we fit together because we were both a little broken, but the thing about broken people is, some of them don't want to be fixed. They just want to hide behind someone else's stability until they find something new to shatter. It started small. The late meetings at work, the phone turned face down on the table, the long showers after girls' nights. I told myself I was paranoid, that my last relationship had made me insecure. I didn't want to be the jealous man. I didn't want to accuse her without proof. Then one night, while she was asleep, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen was Ethan. I knew him. Her coworker. The one she said was like a brother. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But curiosity eats at you when the pieces stop fitting. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I checked her phone. There were dozens of messages. Most were harmless, but buried between them were the ones that broke me open, short, coded, yet unmistakable. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. He'll never know. I stared at the words until the screen went black. My hands were shaking. My chest felt hollow. But what I felt wasn't sadness. It was clarity. A kind of cold, focused silence that only betrayal can give. I didn't confront her right away. I couldn't. I needed to be sure. So I started watching. Her habits, her roots, her lies. Every late meeting became a pattern. Every excuse started to sound rehearsed. And then came the confirmation, a hotel receipt in her purse. Same night, same location. She claimed to be at a client dinner. That was the moment something in me changed. The version of Daniel who believed in love, trust, and second chances died quietly in that living room. The one who replaced him. He didn't cry. He planned. I didn't want to shout, or break things, or beg for explanations. I wanted something colder, something she wouldn't see coming. Because when you love someone deeply, their betrayal isn't just a wound, it's a message. And I intended to answer it in a language she'd understand: precision, exposure, and destruction. So I smiled, kissed her goodnight, and said nothing, but in my head, I had already begun writing the script for her downfall. When betrayal arrives dressed in banal things: hotel receipts folded into a wallet, coffee-stamped loyalty cards, a calendar event deleted at midnight, you learn that violence need not be loud. You learn that most damage does its work in the clean spaces. An email forwarded at 2 a.m., a polite HR inquiry, a withdrawn offer from a committee. I chose that work. I chose slow, surgical ruin. The first job was to stop being visible. I kept living like nothing had changed. I made the same coffee, left the same time, ate lunch at the same bench. Routine is camouflage. People notice anomalies, and I wanted no anomalies. I wanted to be the calm in the center of the storm I intended to build. Then I cataloged everything, not the messy, sentimental list of who said what, when, no. That was already in my head like a dull instrument. I assembled a ledger: dates, times, receipts, screenshots. The little metadata you get when you know where to look. If she'd been careless enough to hide messages in drafts, she'd been careless enough to miss a timestamp. If he'd checked in at a bar with public Wi-Fi, his location left markers the police could follow. I became a scanner of small things. The beep of a hotel keycard, the pattern of rideshare pickups, the names on receipts. I set rules for myself. No lies, no forgeries, no violent theatrics. I wanted the truth to break them, because truth is harder to defend than rumor. If I moved with lies, I would be disentangled by evidence. If I moved with facts, they would need lawyers and money, and sometimes neither heals reputations completely. Step 1 was containment. I opened a burner email and an anonymous cloud account and mirrored everything. Copies in triplicate, stamped with times and hashes. Evidence that could survive a denial, a PR team, and a lawyer's chisel. I didn't want vengeance that evaporated in a press conference. I wanted something that would survive cross-examination. Step 2 was strategic disclosure. I didn't fling the dossier at the world. I placed it where small institutions live, the places that make careers and reputations. HR desks, hiring committees, professional groups. An anonymous packet to Clara's agency compliance officer. An encrypted drop to a mentor Ryan admired. A sterile, forensic-style brief to a journalist I'd read once who specialized in workplace ethics. Each packet read like an audit, timestamps, receipts, corroborating images. No invective, just evidence and a few questions that made people in power decide, quietly, that association was dangerous. I watched the ripple. It began small. A canceled speaking engagement for Clara. A postponed pitch where Ryan's name did not appear on the roster. Casual distancing from colleagues who once bought him drinks. People who owe reputations to one another have short tolerances for smells that suggest rot. They call lawyers, they ask for files, and they think about optics. That thought optics turns easily into action. Invitations are rescinded. Contracts are reassessed. I built a network of small instruments to amplify the truth. Samira, an errands runner with a good heart and the patience of a saint, became my eyes in places I could not be. She would accidentally be near the cafe Clara favored and casually mention she'd seen someone leave in a hurry late at night. Danvers, the reporter, turned the dry packets into careful prose that read like a professional review, not shouty, not personal, but corrosive because it invited institutions to act. A quiet article in the right newsletter is a lever longer and more precise than a scream on social media. There were ethical edges that haunted me. I refused to plant evidence or to live in the realm of falsehood. But as precise as I tried to be, there were moments when the arithmetic of consequence outran my intentions. A mentor forwarded my dossier to counsel and then texted Clara with the thin hope that she'd explain. The text was a polite assassination in 3 words. She called me, voice small as a knocked-over cup, asking me to stop whatever I'd started. Her panic cut through me, but I had made rules. I could not pretend the ledger I kept was only mine. The game changed when Ryan began to panic. Men like him aren't used to being exposed. They panic in ways that reveal new threads. He made mistakes, an email sent to the wrong account, a photo of a receipt uploaded carelessly to a cloud he thought private. Each error widened my view. The more they tried to cover, the shoddier their patches became, and the cleaner my case grew. There were personal tests, too. I watched myself keep distance at the supermarket when she passed by with a friend. I learned to read the small tremor a guilty person carries in their hands. Once, at a gallery evening, I listened to a woman praise Clara's consistent creative vision. I left without speaking. Power demands patience. Patience allows you to choose the exact instrument that will do the most damage. But patience alone was not enough. People pay money for silence. They keep lawyers on retainer and PR firms on speed dial. When the first legal letters arrived to Danvers and the compliance team dialed their processes up, I knew I needed leverage that wasn't easily bought. Money buys common courtrooms. Money does not always buy the public discomfort of a donor withdrawing funds or a trustee resigning in front of cameras. Reputation, I realized, is sometimes more vulnerable to social currency than to legal maneuvering. So I moved the ledger into daylight in the right ways. A time release to Danvers before a board meeting. A second packet to a donor who had been proud of a named gallery wing that, as it turned out, enjoyed the patronage of the very agency now under review. People who put their name on things do not like their names attached to scandals. They call lawyers faster than institutions can. The trick is to make disclosure inconvenient where it matters in the rooms with plaques and chairs and speaking fees. The cost of this geometry was immediate. Once donors started calling, trustees convened emergency meetings. The firm initiated internal reviews. Cougar's smiles at office parties came hollow. Clara became a person who had to answer for her life in bullet points and committee rooms. She began to shrink around me in small ways, less laughter, more weight around the eyes. Seeing that hollow felt like a blade, but the blade had a shape I'd already decided was necessary. And yet, the ledger's logic is contagious. The exposure attracted attention not only from those who could be shamed but from those who felt threatened by being shamed. A black envelope slid under my door one morning with a single Polaroid of my mother at church and on the back, 2 words, "Stop now." The animal inside me, something I had honed into a knife, felt a new human fear. Threats are not arguments. They are instruments of leverage others had at their disposal. That was the moment the plan needed a new vector. I could keep pushing only so far with public discomfort. At some point, the men with deeper pockets and darker patience would push back. If they pushed, they could hurt people I loved. If I stopped, they would rebuild their houses of silence with no beans. I decided to change the game. Not more noise, but smarter pressure. I started to build exposures that could not be easily bought away, evidence that implicated not just the lovers, but the chains of facilitation, vendors, invoice trails, named trustees. If auditors could follow the money to named accounts, and if donors could be shown that their funds were being redirected, then even wealthy men would feel a real sting. Money and optics together are hard to hold with both hands. It required deeper work, calling in favors from an old colleague who knew how to parse server logs without leaving a direct trail back to me, asking Samira to recover a lost invoice from a discarded recycling, convincing a junior accountant to watch a pattern until it became undeniable. Every ally I recruited took risk. I asked too much of people who were not paid to be part of this war. That thought sat at the back of my mind like an ember. The finer things are always the heaviest to carry. In the quiet hours, I would open the ledger and watch the names multiply. I had become an architect of ruin, and with each brick I placed I felt a small tremor of regret. Yet, when I saw Ryan's career begin to collapse, calls unanswered, clients reprioritizing, I also felt a cold vindication. The kind that reads like survival. There is a moment in every escalation where you feel a wrongness and also know you cannot step back without becoming complicit in silence. I reached that line on a rain-slick Tuesday when Clara's mentor called and asked if she was planning to come in the next day. My answer was the ledger, silent and complicated. The decisions I'd made had contours that would not fit easy morality any longer. So I pressed forward. Not loudly, not with fury, but with a surgeon's steady hand. The work required patience, careful alliances, and a stomach for collateral. The ledger told me what to do. The ledger also taught me what I would lose. The next phase would not be simply about exposure. It would be about forcing accounting where legal obfuscation had been the refuge. It would be about naming the facilitators and letting the institutions that trusted them make hard, public choices. That part would be dangerous, slow, and perhaps irreversible. But the man who found himself in a kitchen with a hotel receipt folded in a purse does not often choose the gentle path. He chooses the one that promises a turning of the tide, even if the tide brings wreckage to the shore. People think the hard part of revenge is finding the facts. They're wrong. The hard part is making the facts matter in rooms where people have practiced not caring. Paper is only heavy when the right hands pick it up and read it aloud. I learned that the morning Danvers called. He speaks like someone who's learned to treat wind as a resource, never waste a breeze. I ran the packet, he said. Clean, no drama. I'll stitch it into a longer piece next week. But if you want the thing to move faster, you have to pick a place it hurts them more than it hurts you. He was right, of course. Facts sit like sleeping dogs until someone with a byline shakes them awake. So I gave him the rest. Hotel folios, time-stamped ride receipts, a string of messages clipped and verified, a short audio grab of Ryan's voice in a bar talking the way cheaters talk when they think the room is soft and private. I gave him everything that looked like a professional dossier. And then I handed him the one thing most people forget to compile: the human ledger. Names of the trustees, the donors, the vendors. The people whose plaques and photo ops meant real, measurable money. Danvers wrote like a man who never wanted to be a villain. He wrote the story as if he were building a case study: how trust becomes currency, how comfort becomes corruption. He didn't scream. He wrote a clean, granular piece that read like a needle going into the soft spot of comfort. When it published on a slow Tuesday, it didn't explode. It infiltrated. By Wednesday, Clara's inbox had an invitation rescinded. By Thursday, a donor called the agency and asked politely, sharp as a scalpel, whether their name could be associated with anything unsavory. Trustees convened, calendars were scrubbed, an outside audit was requested. The people who traded in reputations do not react to scandal. They react to risk to their own names. When institutions start to move, lawyers become noise. They write letters. They file motions. They draw lines. They slow things down. The law is a rolling machine, and it favors people with retainer fees. Danvers knew that. So he put human stories in the piece: testimonials from contractors whose calls had gone unanswered, and from the community center whose grant had been delayed. That made the issue less legal and more moral in the public eye. Moral pressure moves money where legal action moves slowly. But the sound of paper spreading through the right rooms has consequences you cannot always predict. 2 days after the article, I found a Polaroid under my door. My mother at bingo, laughing, captured in mid-breath. On the back, stop. Someone who wanted the ledger to stop had chosen my mother as the instrument of fear. They didn't threaten my career or my body. They threatened what I loved. That is not a subtle thing. It changes the math. I called Alvarez and lied by omission in old defense, professional and ugly. He said he'd increase patrols, that he'd flagged my name and would keep an eye out. The detective's voice was steady and empty of promise. He uses words like procedural and paper trail the way a priest uses ritual, both promise a structure that sometimes holds people safe and sometimes does not. People will push back, he said. You need to be careful. The threats did escalate, but in a way that felt almost cultured. Tires slashed, a keyed car. A note taped under my windshield wiper: you made a choice. We will make the consequences public if you do not stop. It read less like intimidation and more like bookkeeping. Someone was keeping their own ledger and marking who owed what. That was the moment I realized 2 things. 1, I had pulled on a thread tied to a much larger fabric. Men above men had been getting comfortable in rooms that had glass facades but iron interiors. 2, making the ledger loud had made me visible. Visibility is a currency that works both ways. You ask people to answer for what they did, and you also become an answerable thing to other forces. Instead of retreating, I chose escalation, calibrated, surgical escalation. The slow burn had worked. The ledger had made people twitch. Now we needed a public moment. The lawyers couldn't easily bury in subpoenas and sealed hearings. A hearing live with trustees answering questions on camera. Danvers liked the idea because it turned process against secrecy. Samira liked it because it forced people who'd relied on donors' inattentiveness to face donors directly. Alvarez, after a long pause, agreed to pressure the right channels to make a regulatory inquiry happen at a useful speed. We arranged the public pressure like a watchmaker ranges gears. Danvers timed his second story to run the morning of the regulatory committee meeting. I fed committee members documents that read like an audit and were notarized enough to provoke an inquiry. Samira quietly gathered people who had been hurt by the diverted funds and asked them to tell their stories if asked. We didn't plan for shaming. We planned for accountability that would be visible and therefore costly. The day of the hearing, the room smelled like citrus and new carpet, the air brittle with politicians and donors who practiced compassion as theater. The trustees sat at the table, faces composed as lawyers posed answers they had rehearsed. Danvers sat in the back, fingers whiter on his pen, and the feed streamed to newsrooms. When the first video evidence, hotel receipts, bank routing, memos, a time-stamped hotel check-in was submitted, something in the room shifted. Men who had been comfortable became uncomfortable. Men who had been paid to keep their mouths shut found themselves under the steady lamp of someone else's ethics. That night, when the hearing adjourned with promises and platitudes, I read the news and kept a ledger in my head. Who had flinched? Who had forced a pause? Who had walked out early? The legal system would do its work, and the law would be slow, but public attention had a velocity money couldn't always buy back. And yet the ledger's music had a new instrument added to it: retaliation. The people I'd exposed were not all fools. Some of them had access to different currencies, networks, favors, and a willingness to intimidate quietly. After the hearing, my mother's bingo club began receiving phone calls about donation ethics. A donor I'd thought we'd sway called my landlord to ask about my reliability as a tenant. The harassment was sophisticated and bureaucratic. It used other people's goodwill as a blade. I felt the weight of it in a way that had little to do with courage and everything to do with responsibility. Why? There's an ugly calculus to being the man who pulls threads. You must decide which maiming you accept and which you will not. I had wanted to make them answer, to force them into rooms where their words mapped easily to evidence. I had not accounted for the tally other people would keep, nor the lengths those people would go to protect the infrastructure they had built. One night, late, I met Clara in the park. She approached with that small, rehearsed smile and the look of a person who had learned how to hide in plain sight. We talked like two people who once loved each other politely at a funeral. Paraphrases. Clipped regrets. Why are you doing this? She asked, as if the ledger were a public health policy rather than a personal vendetta. Because someone had to, I said, blunt and uselessly moral. Because you lied. Because you helped them do it. She folded her hands like a woman at a conference about ethics. We're both paying, she said. Do you think it's only them? Her voice wasn't accusation as much as exhaustion. The world had collapsed into a small set of shards and we were stepping on them. I thought about stopping for a night. I considered moving, handing everything to Alvarez, letting the law clamp down without my hands on the handle. But when I saw how comfortably the men in the hearing room smiled at the cameras afterward, polite, practiced smiles, I knew they were counting on the system's slowness. They were betting on the idea that the public gets bored and donors get distracted. They were betting they could rebuild. I had a ledger. I had a sliver of power. If the system would be slow, I would be persistent. At dawn I opened the ledger and added new entries. The trustee who avoided a question. The vendor whose invoices didn't match the receipts. The lawyer who'd been paid to stall. I also added the names of people I love who were being touched by the backlash. The book was no longer merely a weapon. It was a responsibility. If I kept pulling threads, I had to accept the way the whole fabric might come undone on purpose. When you make paper into sound, you do not simply reveal. You also call the people who keep the house to account, and some of those people will throw their weight against you to keep it standing. The choice, for me, became not whether to stop but how to keep moving without becoming the very thing I had set out to punish. That's the crooked line I walked in the weeks that followed, pushing leaks timed for hearings, protecting witnesses, wearing a suit to court appearances so the cameras would not mistake me for a villain. I learned to sleep with one eye open and to put my mother on a different route to bingo. I learned to ask favors and to accept them. The ledger began to feel less like revenge and more like stewardship, an ugly, lonely caretaking job for the truth I had insisted on revealing, and somewhere in the margins, someone else added their own notes, small, polite threats, thin, anonymous photographs. The ledger's audience had grown. The paper had become sound, and the sound had called other voices. Now the story had more players than I'd imagined, and not all of them were interested in accounting. Some were interested in settling scores. If you want part 4, I'll take the ledger into darker rooms, where threats get personal, alliances are tested, and the man who thought he could control the harm learns the true price of making the truth public. There's a part of power that's invisible until someone decides not to use it. The men I'd nudged into daylight weren't all bravado and bad decisions. Many of them were practiced at keeping doors closed and hands clean. When the publicity made their rooms uncomfortable, they did what those with power do best. They moved the fight into rooms where light didn't reach. The first signs were small and bureaucratic. Subpoenas that asked for irrelevant file types, requests for sealed testimony, lawyers who filed motions the way masters play endgames, delaying, obfuscating, making the process a grind. You can drown a truth in procedure if you have the patience and the money. I watched it happen like a man watching the tide claw back sand he's been shaping by hand. Then the next level answered personal pressure. A charity board member called my landlord with a vague concern about the stability of tenants. My mother's volunteer group received an anonymous inquiry asking them to confirm my attendance at last year's fundraiser. When they politely refused to engage, the car escalated tone into insinuation. My messages became threaded with anonymous pleas and thin threats. Someone left fresh footprints at the back door of our building one night, prints too deliberate to be accidental. That's when the ledger turned from an instrument of exposure into a shield I had to hold up over other people's heads. It was no longer enough to release documents. I had to protect witnesses, to ghost coordinate schedules so Claire could leave town for a week without bumping an unexpected face. I began writing emails not to destroy but to preserve. Names, safe times, backup plans. The ledger's language changed. It read less like a list of accusations and more like tactical instructions. We tried legal routes harder. Alvarez's team began to get traction on the contractor's records. A judge granted a narrow subpoena. A storage unit was opened and the boxes inside smelled like old receipts and new desperation. For a moment, I thought the machine might be slowed. But then lawyers for the higher-ups filed motions asserting privacy rights and business privilege terms that sound like protection and function like armor. The fight became not only about the facts in the room but about who could afford to contest them in court for longer. I got a call from Danvers one night, the kind of call a journalist makes when the tone suggests something worse than a bad headline. "They're looking for you," he said. "Not with cameras, with lists." He told me about men who had been paid to track sources, about private investigators who specialized in making people uncomfortable they don't like being exposed. Danvers said they reframed the battle as harassment by the accuser. "It works, Daniel. People get tired, sources dry up, so we changed tactics." Samira organized logistics for Claire to get out of town for a month and used a circulation of friends and false errands to shield the move. Danvers agreed to run the next piece as a multi-part so that attention flowed intermittently rather than peaking and collapsing. Alvarez set up a channel in his squad room for our witness list and promised discreet phone checks. We invented redundancy, the same way a military unit shadows a convoy, multiple points, multiple backups, unpredictable routes. The personal pressure escalated anyway. One evening, I found my car keyed and the phrase "silent" carved across the driver's door. The police took the report and offered the predictable condolences. Alvarez came by in person and sat across from me, palms flat on the table like a man who wanted to hand me the safest plan he could. "They're testing you," he said. "They're seeing what you'll tolerate." I passed that test by making a choice no one external could force. I refused to be cowed, not because I was brave, but because the ledger had become less about vengeance and more about consequence for people who had built entire economies on the premise of being untouchable. If they could reframe the fight as my harassment campaign, he told me they would. If they could intimidate Claire and the contractors into silence, the case would die in crumbs. We could not allow that, so I began to bake them in ways that made legal and public pressure unavoidable. A trustees' charity gala became our lever. Danvers ran a careful, corroborated piece about the ties between the gala's vendors and shell routing. We coordinated with Alvarez to time a regulatory inquiry so donors would have to ask questions on the record. The headlines were nasty and punctual. Trustees felt the heat in private calls and the heat over their own signatures on polite letters. Men who paid to have reputations sewn back together all of a sudden found their names in newspapers beside words like investigation. But public pressure has a cost. For every trustee who chose transparency, there was another who chose retaliation. An envelope arrived at my mother's house with a photo of her standing by a stall at the community fair and an account number neatly written beneath it. Someone was not only making threats, they were tying them to money to leverage. The message was clear. We can make your ordinary life a nuisance, and we will if you persist. The moral calculus tightened. I had to ask myself what I was willing to sacrifice. I'd engineered ruin for two people who had betrayed me, but the web I'd pulled unreached men who kept silent for a reason. The ledger had awakened networks that do not forgive curiosity. The knowledge that my actions endangered others sat heavy in my chest. That's when an unexpected thing happened. Claire fought back in a way I hadn't expected. She stopped being the hollowed, frightened woman I'd seen at the hearing. She began to meet us with practical strategies, names of people who'd paid for events where hush money had shuffled through, small details about invoice codes she'd seen in draft emails. It wasn't contrition, it wasn't grace. It was survival and maybe, in part, a reassertion of her personhood. "I don't want to disappear," she told me once. "I want this to end because I need to live in the same town as my mother without people talking about me when I walk into a shop." Her voice was brittle but steady. That steadiness carried a cost. We put Claire in witness protection for part of the process. She left with a duffel and the odd look of someone who had been half a race. The sight of her at the airport, head down, a woman I'd once loved folding herself like paper into a new shape, stayed with me for a long time. Protection is a strange kindness that also acknowledges a failure. It says, "We cannot keep you here safe. Let us move you somewhere else." The legal machine chewed onward. We secured one small victory when a court compelled the contractor to hand over bank records tied to the tent invoices. The document trail was a ribbon that led to a few operatives who'd done the discreet dirty work. Arrests were made not of the top trustees or the men who'd signed the biggest checks, but of the couriers and middlemen who had accepted cash for quiet. Their arrests were visible and messy. They bared the gears that made the system run. Still, the men in suits adapted. They claimed plausible deniability. They called it administrative oversight. They hired PR firms who retaught them how to look regretful without admitting liability. They shifted vendors. They replaced names. They paid hush money under new accounts. The system recoiled and knit itself with new threads, and while the system adapted, the personal attacks grew more imaginative. A man I'd once gone to university with and touched by the scandal so far found his business in a niche market suddenly audited by tax authorities who found irregularities. The man lost contracts, and his wife cried at 2 a.m. in the kitchen. Was it retaliation? I can't prove it, but the pattern was there. Pressure applied upward will spill out sideways. And sometimes the spill hits people who had nothing to do with the original betrayal. The ledger in my drawer began to look like the weather. Forecasts of damage I could create and forecasts of damage that could be done to me. I started to sleep in different rooms. I bought 2 phones and gave one to Alvarez. I hired a security consultant under the pretense of home alarm analysis. The costs piled up in quiet bills that a man who used to have simple monthly spreadsheets had not prepared for. What bound me was not merely a desire to punish. It was an emerging conviction that some systems needed to be made inhospitable to quiet corruption. If the cost of doing that was personal sacrifice, security measures, missed birthdays, a life organized around perimeter checks, then that was the price I had to accept. It felt noble at times and monstrous at others. The turning point came on a rain-smeared Thursday when Danvers' third piece ran. The contractor's bank records, printed across the front page, linked via trail to a trustee who'd always smiled prettily over charity plaques. The trustee resigned 2 days later, but the press cycle had moved on. There were new scandals to feed public appetite. It wasn't enough. Late that week, a man with a scarred eyebrow and a slow smile came to my doorstep. He did not speak like a thug. He spoke like someone who'd been given instructions in a boardroom. You forced us to rearrange, he said. We had to protect our friends. We had to make choices. We made them. He slid a thin envelope into my hand. Inside, a single photograph of my mother and her church group, clear and recent. On the back, a single sentence. Last chance. The anger that flared then was not righteous. It was primitive and ugly. I could have called Alvarez and watched the man walk away. I could have handed the photograph to a police officer and asked the law to move. Instead, in a moment I am not proud of, I answered in a way the ledger had taught me, by taking the fight into rooms their money had once sheltered. I leaked a file that pointed to a secondary web of transactions, small, messy payments that turned out to be reimbursements for hush arrangements. I did it anonymously to a journalist who ran it not as a sensationalist hit, but as a compliance note with implications. The response was immediate. A donor publicly withdrew funding from a gala and demanded an independent trustee review. The trustee in question, newly exposed, called every favor he had, and still could not stop the stream of names crawling into public findings. The man with the scar called once more, voice flat and sardonic. You made a choice, he said, and your choice made this personal. Then he hung up. I stood in my kitchen with the photograph of my mother in my hand and the ledger open on the table like a Bible. I had crossed a line. The ledger was no longer just an instrument of exposure. It had become a weapon that could be turned on anyone. I had aimed it at the men who hid and found that the further upstream you cut, the more downstream the splash. In trying to make the rooms uncomfortable, I'd invited men who will tolerate no discomfort to make discomfort my daily bread. That night I slept poorly and dreamt of lists, names followed by arrows and consequences, lives tallying like accounting entries. In the morning, I called Alvarez and told him everything, every leak, every anonymous send, every contact. I admitted that I'd stepped outside neat lines and used the ledger as more than record keeping. His silence when he listened was exacting. You did what you thought was right, he said finally, voice tired. But right now we protect witnesses, and you get to be a witness too. Lay low, let us move. The ledger had made enemies who do not negotiate. It had bought me a fragment of justice and a long tail of risk. The rooms had fought back, and we had absorbed the blows. The fight had become a campaign of attrition. and attrition wears everyone down. In the margins of the ledger I began to write different notes. Protect mother. Alternate bank, assure Danvers safety, legal fund for contractors. The pages that had held evidence now also held logistics, names of safe houses, burner numbers, times to meet. The ledger had become not just the account of betrayal but the manual for survival. If I learned anything in that long, dark season, it was this: exposing rot demands courage and patience, but it also demands humility. You will not control every outcome, and you will not shield every person who might be hurt as the shockwaves travel. The rooms that profit from silence will always have friends who prefer the darkness. They will fight to keep it. The ledger taught me strategy. Life taught me cost. I paid both and kept walking, because stopping meant letting the rooms win. When you start a ledger, you think you can control the arithmetic. You imagine columns, neat subtraction, a clean total at the end where wrongs are balanced, and you can go back to being a man who makes coffee at 6 and sleeps without listening for tires on the street. That was a lie I told myself to keep going. The last phase of this thing was never going to be a tidy courtroom scene where every villain goes to jail and every victim gets a medal. Real life is messier. Justice is partial. The powerful erode the edges of truth with money and procedure. Still, there are moments where the pressure you apply meets a weak point and cracks something open. And the weeks after those cracks are the part of the work where you either accept the noise you made or you let it crush you. We had prepared as much as we could. Danvers timed releases and pushed the narrative into regulatory committees. Alvarez worked subpoena angles quietly, the way a man builds a case without press releases. Samira kept people safe, with errands that looked like errands and routes that were not. Claire, once hollow, came back in small, sharp ways: documents, names, memories of invoices that had seemed like dull administration and became evidence. She testified with a steadiness that surprised me. Or maybe I was the one who'd changed and assumed everyone would buckle the way I had expected to. The first indictments named a handful of operators, couriers, accountants, a contractor who had thought paperwork could hide cash movement. They pleaded. They flipped. That's how it works. The small men get cold, and their mouths open. Their testimony scraped at higher branches. For every confession there was a negotiation. For every wire transfer exposed there was a lawyer who knew how to dress a story in plausible deniability. There were arrests that felt satisfying in the immediate way of seeing a ledger entry become a handcuff. There were plea deals that felt like a sting because men with names and money walked free after paying fines that would be a lifetime for others. The law did what the law could do with the evidence we gave it. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was the bitterest consolation possible. What I had not priced into my arithmetic was how many people became collateral. Contractors who had been paid with hush funds had families. Donors who were careless had reputations tied to philanthropic programs that fed schools and breakfasts. Volunteers who trusted names on plaques found themselves dragged into depositions. The ledger had teeth, and like teeth, they bit clean and indiscriminate. A woman who ran a neighborhood after-school program lost a year of funding because the donor withdrew until investigations finish. Children missed classes. Small harms add up in ways that don't show up on headlines. Claire left town quietly after her testimony, accepted relocation through a program I'd never imagined she'd need. She handed me a single note before she left. You wanted the ledger to speak. It did. I need to be somewhere the noise can't find me. Her handwriting was small. She was not angry in that goodbye, only exhausted. Watching her go felt less like victory and more like a necessary amputation. There were nights after that when I would go to the riverside and think about what we'd done. The river keeps moving. It makes no moral claims. It accepts things you throw into it and moves them downriver. I learned to imagine my ledger as something slightly less heroic, an object that keeps record but does not cleanse. The names I'd archived lived on its pages. and I kept copies in safe places like a man who is both prudent and haunted. The men who'd been most culpable in the scheme, those with deep pockets and legal teams, did not face the same level of personal consequence. They lost contracts or saw boards reshuffle. Some paid fines and quietly adjusted their giving strategies. A few retreated for a season and came back with no PR firms that rewrote histories. It's an ugly truth. Exposure is rarely final for those who can buy time. But it is not meaningless. Some trustees resigned, some foundations changed policies, audits were strengthened. The architecture of comfortable secrecy woke, linked, and then learned new habits. Changing a system is a long game. We made a start. There were threats that never stopped being thin knives. A car keyed late at night. A voicemail that was machine soft and precise. We were inconvenienced. Consider the cost. My mother's church received an anonymous call that soured a small fundraiser. The man who used to bring me tea in the mornings, my neighbor, stopped making small talk. It is astonishing how killing an illusion makes the rest of the world recalculate. Legal consequences arrive for me. Two not criminal, but civil inquiries, a few angry letters. A firm that tried to sue for reputational damages claimed I'd orchestrated a smear campaign. I answered everything in statements and copies of the dossiers I'd compiled. I let Alvarez cross-examine my motives. In a public hearing, the prosecutor asked me why I had not taken a different route, why I had chosen anonymity and sabotage before turning to law. There is a bluntness in that question that has the sound of someone checking a moral balance sheet. My answer was honest and not remotely noble, because I wanted them to feel what I felt when I learned they hid behind me, because I wanted a kind of accountability I didn't see happening otherwise. The prosecutor wrote that down and then asked whether I regretted it. I did, in rooms where faces of the harmed came to mind. I didn't regret the exposure of corruption. I regretted the ways it made ordinary people pay. Time passes and public attention thins. The news cycles move on. Trustees who once spoke with gravity about stewardship found other causes to appear before the cameras. Men who had been the comfortable beneficiaries of others' silence moved their money, rewired channels, and made sure their next transactions were cleaner, smarter. The system adapts. It is its own predator, and it learns. My ledger stayed. I boxed copies and distributed them to those I trusted. Danvers kept one in case history needed corroboration. Alvarez filed another in a cold case drawer for prosecutors who might want to reopen. Samira kept a thumb drive in a safety deposit box. I kept a thin paper copy on a shelf, and on quiet nights, I would read it like someone reading a prayer I didn't deserve. The pages smelled of paper and coffee. The names sat there, neat and terrible. What surprised me most was not the small victories or the partial justice, but the way the work changed me. The man who had once loved without margin became a man who made lists and optimized ruin. I learned to calculate risk for other people and to tolerate my own numbness. I learned that vengeance makes you efficient, and that efficiency is a different kind of cruelty. Sometimes, when the apartment is quiet and the city hums, I catch myself rehearsing the ledger's logic and realize how comfortable it has made me with control. That terrified me more than any anonymous call ever could. In the end, the ledger did two things. It forced some of the rot into light, where law and donors could not entirely ignore it, and it taught others how to move more carefully. It did not rematerialize the lost trust I had with Clara. It did not return the nights I'd spent trying to pretend everything was fine. It left a residue on friendships, on neighborhood safety, on my mother's day-to-days. Claire's last message, sent from a number I did not recognize. Months after she left, read, "You were right to want truth. You were wrong to imagine it would come without cost." She did not ask for anything. She did not demand my apologies. She only let me hold her words and think about the shape of the things I'd done. On some mornings now, I take the ledger down and write a line in the margin that was never there before. Repair where you can. I make small acts donating to a community fund with money traced back through one of the exposed channels, volunteering discreetly at the soup kitchen the contractor's family used to fund. They are small and hardly reparation, but they are attempts. The ledger will never balance perfectly, but small reweavings matter to the people who live them. If you ask me whether I would do it all again, I have an answer that tastes like metal, yes and no. Yes, because some corrupt constructions needed to be interrupted. No, because the interruption cost more than I was prepared to pay for the people I loved. The two statements are not contradictory. They are the ledger's cruel arithmetic. The city moves on. Men rebuild. New vendors appear. New mechanisms for hiding are invented as old ones fall. That is the cycle. But there is one small, stubborn fact I hold on to. For a time a ledger existed that remembered names and transactions and consequences. That memory will be a small defense for someone, someday not a perfect defense, but a record. Records matter. I keep the ledger behind a box of old receipts. I sleep with a light sometimes. I call my mother on Sundays and let the conversation run into insignificant things. I keep my eyes low in rooms where men flatter each other with compliments that smell like commerce. The ledger sits like a bruise I tend to quietly. What I learned is not a clean lesson in righteousness. It's an ugly education in cause and effect. That truth has weight. That weight breaks things. That when you drop it into a crowded room, the shards can cut anyone who is near. The choice to drop it is not simply about righting a wrong. It is about being ready to carry the cuts when they come back across your skin. The ledger is closed for now. I do not add names easily anymore. I keep it as a reminder that some debts demand accounting, but accounting is not the same as peace. If you insist on making a world answer for its small cruelties, do not expect the world to let you do it without also answering you back. Sometimes, at night, I opened the ledger to a random page and read a name, someone who paid, someone who broke, someone who was broken. I whisper an apology into the quiet for the parts I could not spare and for the parts I chose to spend. Then, I close the book, make coffee at 6, and try to live the same small life a man is allowed to have after he has looked too long at what other people keep hidden.